one thing is essential. To accelerate decisions, you need innovation that fits the mission. We innovate from AI to zero trust. We integrate using open APIs that you control. We automate with smart solutions so warfighters know and act faster. Your mission, accelerated. Tomorrow's challenges, anticipated. Win faster with Booz Allen.
Hello and welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. I'm Arons, Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. Today we're going to talk about DOD's Acquisition Innovation Research Center. The Acquisition Innovation Research Center, or AIRC, was established in September 2020 by DOD to help infuse innovation and bring in expertise of alternative disciplines from academia to better allow DOD to shape its acquisition practices to respond to rapidly changing threats, technological advances, and even new business models. My guest today to help us understand what all of that means is Dr. Dinesh Verma. Thanks for joining us, Dinesh.
Good to be here, Aaron.
So Dinesh is the Executive Director of the Systems Engineering Research Center, or CIRC, which is the first university-affiliated research center established by the DoD for systems engineering. It's housed at the Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey. Dinesh is also a professor of systems engineering at Stevens, and prior to this role, he served as the Dean of the School of Systems and Enterprises at Stevens, as well as some time in industry as a technical director at Lockheed Martin Undersea Systems. Dinesh is very well known around town as a thought leader in areas like systems engineering and research and development, and I've considered him a close colleague and good friend for many years now. So thanks, Dinesh, for joining us today on the podcast.
Look forward to it.
So I tried to give you a little bit on your background, but didn't do it justice. So tell us a little more about your background and how you got to this position.
I appreciate that, Arun. I'm one of those relatively few faculty members who spent a decent amount of time in industry before joining academia. Right after I finished my doctoral studies at Virginia Tech, joined what used to be IBM Federal Systems, became L'Oreal Federal Systems, became Lockheed Martin Federal Systems, and through a set of sheer coincidences got introduced to the leadership at Stevens Institute of Technology. Initially became a visiting faculty member at Stevens Institute, and then joined full-time as a tenure stream faculty member. Helped begin their systems engineering graduate degree program. And then in 2007, the then president provost and the trustees at Stevens felt that there was enough within the broader research, engineering, and educational community to justify a school focused on systems and enterprises. And I had the opportunity to become the founding dean of that school. Around that time, we had ongoing conversations with leadership within the department, the engineering and science leadership within the department, about how, as systems became more complex, perhaps more software intensive, we needed to rethink the toolkit that engineers used for engineering, particularly systems engineering. That led to the department having a competitive solicitation to establish a UARC focused on systems engineering, with the intent of developing, modern methods, tools, practices to support the department's evolution towards increasingly more complex systems, and so on and so forth. And about 12, 13 years into that journey, we were asked by the department, in this case, there was a wonderful collaboration between OUSD R&E and OUSD ANS for the CIRC to take stewardship of the Acquisition Innovation Research Center, which in my mind was exciting because for us, the DoD acquisition system represented one of the most complex socio-political technical systems. And it would be wonderful for a UARC focused on systems-related issues to perhaps do what it could to support the department, as you alluded to, coming up with perhaps a different way of thinking about what the long-term issues have been, to help perhaps increase the efficiency and effectiveness of DoD's acquisition system.
So, for clarification purposes, what is the difference between a university that does work with the Department of Defense and a UARC that does work with the Department of Defense?
So that's a really good question. So, as you know, there's only about 15 UARCs that have been established by the DoD. A UARC is often established by the DoD in areas where they feel it's of strategic value and benefit to the department long term, and they want to enhance their capacity with regard to research development in that strategic realm of emphasis. Until not too long ago, most of the UARCs were established at large, comprehensive universities, research-intensive universities. And if you look at the list of UARCs that have been there since World War II, you get a sense for that they're really established at large, comprehensive universities that have the scale and the capacity to do what the department needs of them. The CIRC took a different governance model. In the way the department established the CIRC, and then, of course, after that, AIRC, it was not so much that Stevens was a large, comprehensive university. We are not. We are a focused, technologically focused university. But rather that we could be good stewards of a network of universities, national network of universities that were focused on systems-related matters. And so the CIRC, and then, of course, AIRC, was the first UARC established with a networked model, where today, if you were to go to the CIRC website or the AIRC website, Stevens is the steward of this UARC, but we have a couple of dozen other universities that are members of our network, and we leverage faculty and research resources and, in fact, research infrastructure across our 24 partner universities as well.
So you talked about the systems engineering history of the CIRC, and then maybe even contrasted that a little bit with the mission of the AIRC. How would you describe what the AIRC is distinct from the CIRC? Or how is its mission slightly different?
So the differences between AIRC and CIRC can be along multiple dimensions. So I'll begin with something rather important, but not that interesting, perhaps, for the broader audience. The CIRC, the primary sponsorship is with OESD R&E, whereas with AIRC, the primary sponsorship is with OSD ANS.
So one side is the research and engineering side, the AIRC
and the other
the acquisition side.
That's right. But more interestingly, perhaps, from an academic point of view, up until the establishment of AIRC, my predominant focus was to engage with faculty colleagues in engineering and science. It was when we got stewardship of AIRC, it caused us to broaden our aperture to faculty in political science, in business, in policy, in law, because all those dimensions matter. We can talk about AI all day long, but then you have to also consider the inherent issues relating to data rights and IP rights relating to that technology domain, for example. So the moment you start to take a true systems view, you cannot be focused on just the technology dimension. You have to be focused on the policy dimension, the business process dimension. In some ways, I might say that a lot of the technical issues with digital transformation, digital engineering, and so on, we know how to tackle. The tougher problem is to somehow figure out how do we impact the business cadence, within the department, for us to really have the department get the benefit of the research that's been done, perhaps even on the engineering and the technical side. And so the two aspects make for a system that is that much more complex and perhaps more interesting. And so I would say the biggest difference from my point of view is that we have faculty members now very broadly across multiple disciplines engaged, on research projects within ERIC.
And so broadly, when I think about what the AIRC is trying to do, and maybe this is insulting, but it's to support acquisition reform. But
Yes.
maybe do it in a way that is more based in traditional academic, multidisciplinary research like you're talking about. Okay, for another contrast then, if you're trying to do research work to support acquisition reform, what does that say about all the work that was done to support all the previous efforts of acquisition reform? What would you do that would be slightly different than all of the previous work that went into all of the previous waves of reform?
So it would be silly for me to say that amazingly talented and insightful people have not thought about this. So you only have to look at reports that have been published over the last 10, 15, 20 years that really tell you what the department should do differently. A lot of people have said that. Often one has to scratch their heads and say, well, why isn't this happening? And so to a certain extent, the creativity that is supporting the department in the form of think tanks and FFRDCs and so on, the department needs is critical. What ERIC provides is perhaps an alternative viewpoint and perhaps a different way of looking at a research project. For us, when we get a research project or research task, it's not sufficient for us to end with a report and recommendations. That may be the case in some research tasks, but our research model is once we're given a problem, we do research on it. We want to create a computational model representing the problem space and perhaps the solution space, so we can do what-if analyses. We want to apply that model, pilot it, and then as necessary, perhaps transition it where it might actually be used and have an impact. Perhaps even translate the research results into a short course that might perhaps become part of the collateral at Defense Acquisition University or other universities, as an example. So to a certain extent, think of ERIC as applied research, leveraging faculty and undergraduate and graduate students who perhaps might come at that same old problem from a slightly different, perhaps fresher perspective.
So that's it. But at the same time, you still tap into traditional knowledge, tired old acquisition reformers like myself. I'm a fellow trying to help out you at the ERIC.
I wouldn't call that community tired old. I would call them frustrated, right? Because they know what needs to be done. I've met amazing people in the course of the last 3 years on this issue of defense acquisition who have been thinking about this for decades. So you're right. For us not to leverage that insight would be silly. So I would generally say to you that our research falls into 3 broad categories. In each of those 3 categories is very applied in nature. Now, when I say it's applied in nature, for us, a good research project is one where faculty members are working with their students, but they have a very consistent and regular cadence of engagement with the sponsors. So that's true across all 3 categories of projects that I'm going to perhaps, if there was a taxonomy, I would say there's 3 broad categories of projects. One category of project is where you have a faculty member working with graduate students that may not need to know the tribal language of the DOD acquisition system. So an example might be, can we do something new and unique in how we educate and upskill the DOD acquisition workforce? This is a case where we have a very creative faculty member at Texas A&M who's come up with the concept of cognitive assistance, in this case, particularly focused on cost estimation and so on and so forth. And this is a case where they're engaging with CAPE, and the results at this point are remarkable, to where we are going through the process of transitioning this cognitive assistance so that folks within the cost estimation community writ large, and in particular CAPE, can use the results from this research project. So there's a slew of projects which are sufficiently decoupled from the DoD tribal knowledge, the alphabet soup of acronyms and organizations and so on, that faculty members can engage with the sponsors and essentially are not constrained by the lack of that domain knowledge. So we have a bunch of projects in that realm. There's a second category of projects where faculty members, if they did not have, so our chief scientist, Dr. Phil Anton, calls it faculty-led but expert-enabled or expert-guided. So we have a second category of projects where we depend upon senior subject matter experts that we have brought on board within AIRC under this concept of AIRC Fellows, who engage with our faculty members with regard to understanding the statutes and policies that cause certain organizational boundaries to be where they are, as certain functions get executed within the DoD acquisition system. As an example, a faculty member who has no sense for how JSIDS works or why it works the way it does,
the requirements process
might come in and just have perhaps a useful but uninformed, from the point of view of the domain experts, view on what could be done, should be done to change the way the department goes about its requirements process. So in this case, we do not want to curtail the creativity of the faculty member, but they can benefit from knowing how the governance structures, why the boundary conditions exist the way they do. Sometimes perhaps one can get into a discussion, rightly so, whether those boundary conditions help or hurt the department. But there are a number of projects where the faculty members benefit from a close relationship with domain experts, so that they're not wasting their time coming up the learning curve, trying to understand legacy, history, what got us where we are, this act or this statute or that statute. The domain experts help us with that. So that's
in some senses, the native guide can get the academic expert who maybe understands a different methodological approach, but get them to the right question.
That's correct. Or even tell them where certain kinds of data might be available that the faculty member may not be aware of, And then the third category, I would say, falls into the minority. But there's a third category of projects where they're really led by domain experts, where a small number of projects, like a quick reaction from a leader within the department, what would you do in this case or that case or whatever? In that case, it is really led by the domain expert and supported by the faculty. So I'll give you an example of that. So in one case, recently we were asked, hey, what are the recommendations with regard to acquisition that have been made in the last 10 years? In this case, instead of a domain expert going and reading, 100 reports and then synthesizing it, we were able to quickly leverage a faculty member to use natural language processing to quickly create a tool. And literally within 3 weeks, we were able to summarize, 80, 90 reports. But then at that point, the faculty member doesn't know what the right taxonomy might be in order to present the results of that analysis to the leadership. And so that's an example of a case where the domain expert really leads and the faculty member supports. And to a certain extent, that's also useful for us because it is continuing education for our faculty members. Every time they work with a domain expert, they understand the DoD acquisition system just a bit more. That makes them more interesting, more relevant to us within AIRC for the next project and so on and so forth. So hopefully that makes sense.
So is this then social science or management science? It sounds less and less like physics and engineering.
Well, in some cases, it would not fall into what you would consider mainstream engineering and science, yes. And so when you say social science, if you go back to, you know, the definition of what that phrase even means, we're really saying, well, we're trying to study the inner relationships between individuals in the context of a society or an organization. And often, social science um, used to relate to something like sociology. But today, if you look at well, what constitutes social science, it includes sociology. It includes things like anthropology, management, political science, economics, and so on. Now, in the last 10, 15 years or so, there's been another field called computational social science, where as we have increased our ability to collect data, and as we have developed creative modeling methods or simulation methods like agent-based modeling, or game theoretic approaches, or game theory and network modeling, and so on and so forth, we are able to in fact apply computational methods to some of these social science problems also, where it's not to say that you'll get a closed form solution at the end. That's not the intent, but at least you get an ability to simulate certain kinds of, in some cases, policies or incentive structures and so on, to see how in the context of that organization or that social construct, how critical stakeholders might respond to a set of policies or a set of incentive structures and so on and so forth. I would say to you generally that in computational social sciences, it's one of those really creative fields where you have engineering faculty members who are really strong in computational methods, working with faculty members from the social sciences arena, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of really good work going on, as you say, within social science and management science, that we're trying to get to the department in the form of practical methods, approaches, and models, and so on.
Yeah, one of the things that we used to talk about when I was on Capitol Hill was the irony that the Department of Defense will fund university researchers to study almost everything that DOD has to deal with, threats and technology, but never seems to ask the university community to ask DOD about how it runs itself.
Yeah.
And so accessing this community for some of those challenging questions like acquisition has a great benefit, in the sense that if you can fix anything, you've touched everything.
Yes, that's true. I'll also say to you, Arun, that um, it's interesting for us to keep latencies in mind when you're dealing with academia. Um, so the CIRC was established about 16 years ago, and I would say we matured to a point where we were having an impact with transitional research, probably a decade later. And because it took us that time, I mean, to create a trusting, collaborative community of research faculty across a couple of dozen universities is not that easy. But we've managed that, thankfully. We are leveraging all that goodwill now as we get going with ERIC. To a certain extent, ERIC has benefited from what we did within the CIRC, and to a certain extent, a lot of the research we're doing within ERIC has accelerated because of the groundwork that was laid a dozen years earlier by CIRC and so on and so forth. Um, I would say that one of the one of the interesting things for faculty members, so you say that the department doesn't perhaps or could invest more in looking at how it goes about the process of acquisition. From a faculty member point of view, you hit pay dirt when you meet with leaders who are able to translate the big challenges that they're dealing with into pithy research questions. Why is it that this doesn't happen? Or what is the problem with this? So for us, often, you're going to make progress when you're dealing with a leader who's dealing with massive challenges, but every once in a while you'll meet with a leader who's able to translate those big problems into pithy research questions that really becomes a starting point for the faculty members, across multiple disciplines: engineering, science, political science, business, law, etc., etc.
So, what are some of your favorite projects that are going on right now or about to start?
So, um, one of my favorite projects is a project that you said doesn't sound at all like engineering, will not sound at all like engineering or science. Um, you talked, on the other hand, you talk to any engineering or science leader or any acquisition or sustainment leader, whether within OST or the services, and if you ask them, why isn't something like this happening or why isn't that happening, you hear this word culture all the time. We have to get over our cultural impedance. For an engineer, this word culture is like this hard to wrap your hands around issue. How do you deal with culture? And so in this case, we got lucky where we had a couple of really creative faculty members at Ohio State in the School of Public Administration and Industrial Engineering, where they've done some really interesting research in collaboration with the Air Force ICC to understand really what are the enablers, leadership enablers to impact culture within an organization. What are the impedance factors? And they have literally created a workshop to take, um, you know, the workforce through to help give, at least build the awareness of what might cause them to behave in a manner that you and I might think is more creative, or more innovative. So I'm really excited about that. We're in the process, I would say, of transitioning that research, where we had a couple of workshops at AFICC to validate the research, and we're now hopefully in the next few months we're going to do that workshop in other organizations too. It's not limited to the contracting world; it can be applied to any acquisition function. But I'm really excited about that research. As it's not a lot of money, but it really is creative in the way the faculty went about this. And not only were their findings and insights useful, but also I think it has a possibility of significant impact on how the department views some of these age-old problems and so on and so forth.
And I know you're doing work with students as well. And that's one of the advantages. And maybe it brings the next generation of people thinking about these problems that my generation couldn't solve.
No, I would say that if along the realm of you saying, what am I really proud of? I'll give you another project where, you know, um, we talk about digital acquisition. Well, you can only imagine the tribes, the acquisition tribes that all exist within the department with their own tribal language, their own cadence, their own methods and tools, and so on and so forth. And in a digital transformation context, you want to get them to become more collaborative with each other through a continuum of data and models. Well, a core academic issue, intellectual issue is how do you represent that information so that it's semantically interoperable? When I speak in my language, somebody else speaking another tribal language understands what I'm saying and can relate it to their tribal language. How do we do it computationally? And so there's a really creative team at Stevens Institute led by Dr. Mark Blackburn, who's done a lot of work in developing computational ontologies so that they can become semantically interoperable. And this problem is not just in engineering, where you may have a thermal analysis team that has a language separate from a ballistics team, that has a language separate from a reliability team. But that's just in engineering. Now, if you look at engineering working with the cost estimation team and the test evaluation team and the sustainment and product support team, how do we cause this information model to come about to where we can really, as a department, take advantage of what's possible through machine learning, computational reasoning, and so on and so forth. So there's quite a bit of work that I think is pretty exciting.
So when you think about why DoD should care, um, understand the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment sort of owns the relationship with the AIRC. But if you had to tell other DoD offices why they should engage with the AIRC and what possible benefits they could see to their office, given this it is university research, how do you talk them through that?
So, um, a UARC is a trusted partner with the department. We represent a strategic resource for the department. Now, in this case, you have a UARC that is ostensibly focused on the acquisition system, not on technology domain, but on the acquisition system. And we have the ability to harness the creativity across the 25 universities and beyond. We're not limited to the 25 universities. But then we also have domain experts who are our AIRC fellows. So if you're looking to solve a problem that could benefit from rigorous research that is informed by the pragmatics of the domain knowledge, what works, what doesn't work, what the constraint sets are, and so on and so forth. And you're interested in results taking the form of applicable models, tools, methods, processes that hopefully then transition and have an impact on your organization across any of the acquisition functions, whether it's sustainment, contracting, cost estimation, test and evaluation, as we are currently involved already. We'd love to engage. And I'm actually proud that within our UARC, we've tried to stay with the classical academic model as much as we can, which is faculty members working on release time with grad students so that we are producing seed corn for the future. A lot of our students end up joining the DOD, the services, or the defense industrial base. And so in that regard, it makes me feel good that we have this treadmill of really creative students that come through the CIRC and AIRC and end up becoming members of the DoD acquisition workforce, or the industry that is supporting the DoD acquisition workforce.
So it becomes a pipeline for their future workforces as well.
That's correct. Yeah.
So NDIA has lots of different kinds of members, including those government employees at those offices. But if you're trying to talk to NDIA university members or NDIA industry members, how would you tell them to engage with AIRC and CIRC?
So Arun, I would say that we have engaged with NDIA and its membership, but we could do so much better than we have in the past. As an example, next week, we have a research workshop, AI for systems engineering and systems engineering for AI. It's fully subscribed. That's an example of a workshop where faculty members come together with our colleagues from the DoD and perhaps other federal agencies like NIST and DOE and DOT and so on and so forth, as well as industry. And so we often will have these research workshops, which for us, from an academic point of view, is the ideal way for us to get insights, thoughts, ideas, and perhaps even criticism. Why are you focused on that? That's not going to have much impact on X or Y. I think that's okay too. But I think these kinds of forums that we put together, some which we've done in collaboration with NDIA in the past, is perhaps the ideal way for us to get engaged with robustly with your industry partners as well as the academic institutions that are members of the NDIA.
So with that, we're going to have to bring the conversation to a close. Do you want to talk about future events coming up from the CIRC or AIRC that might be of interest?
So as I mentioned, next week we have this research workshop, SE for AI and AI for SE. We are in the midst of organizing a number of events, late fall, early winter, and spring of next year. I'll just encourage the audience of this podcast series to look for those events on the CIRC website and the AIRC website. We would love to have a much more robust engagement from industry at our events going forward. Thank you, Arun.
Yeah, and so thank you also, Dinesh, for joining us on today's podcast. I want to tell the audience that we also have some upcoming events. We're doing something with one of our partners, the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, a short course on industrial policy. That'll be September 25th and 26th. There's the Future Forces Conference event down in Virginia Beach, really heavily focused on munitions and armaments and emerging technologies to support them. That's September 24th to 26th. Registration is open. Women in Defense Conference, the annual meeting of that affiliate organization within NDIA, is in Arlington, and that's on September 24th. Information on all of those events is available on NDIA's website. Along the lines of the AI for systems engineering work that Dinesh talked about, we're co-hosting an event with the MITRE Corporation called Leveraging Artificial Intelligence in Acquisition, really talking about how AI-enabled tools can support the work of the acquisition workforce. I think it's very complementary, Dinesh, to your event. That symposium is going to be held at McLean, Virginia, at MITRE's Tyson's Corner location on October 18th. Registration information is also available on NDIA's website. Please keep looking at the website to sign up for our mailing list, register for our various webinars, events, educational offerings, including our Tech 101 series. If you've enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date for all of our latest content. A special thank you to Melanie Yu and Daniel Park for producing this content. Thanks again, Dinesh, for joining us today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Arun.
And thanks everyone for tuning into Emerging Tech Horizons.